someone who gets things fixed. Ask yourself this question, do you want to be rich? I got the brains, you've got the looks. Let's make lots of money. You've got the brawn, I've got the brain. Let's make lots of money.
All right, folks, welcome back. When we get together in class this week, we're going to have a test case about the scope of the federal government's power to regulate commerce. That is, how the Supreme Court has applied the Commerce Clause. But because this is so complicated, because the court has articulated so many rules with respect to this, for the first time ever, I have produced for you and am going to encourage you to use in class a cheat sheet about the Commerce Clause. And actually, I'd like you to have that by your side while you listen to this video as well. You can actually take notes right on the sheet itself. So as you learn about the meaning of various different elements of the Supreme Court's rules on this, you can actually take note of it right there. Okay, but the first thing I have to tell you about is the Commerce Clause itself. Article 1, Section 8 has two relevant clauses. The first clause says the Congress shall have power, and then it lists a lot of things off in that section. Clause 3 is the one important for us today, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Okay, so notice the differing uses of the word with and among there. If we, as the United States, have commerce with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes, but we, as citizens of the several states, engage in commerce among ourselves, then there's some sort of different vision of the elements of commerce that are being indicated by each clause here. With seems to imply some sort of separation. Let me give you a sample sentence. We exchange gifts with each other. That seems to imply that we're separate people reaching across some sort of divide to pass each other these gifts. But among seems to imply an action happening on the interior. So let me give you a sample sentence of that. We exchange gifts among each other. That seems to imply that we are a group tied together by some bonds on the inside, and the action being pointed to is the transfer within that group. So you might think that it makes most natural sense to say that two people exchange gifts with each other. A boyfriend and girlfriend, for instance, can't exchange gifts among each other. And you might think it makes most natural sense that among implies something like an office party, maybe a white elephant gift exchange, where things moved around among members of a group, that is, on the interior of the group. So the words of the Constitution, therefore, imply something about the regulated actions. And courts have, for a very long time, indicated that the use of the word among is meant to describe commerce both between and within the states. The actions being pointed to are the ones on the interior of the group here being the United States and its citizens, not just between two states as separated or divided entities. Had the Constitution said between, that might imply that what happens within Virginia, say, is Virginia's business entirely, and only when Virginia trades between itself and Maryland can the federal government become involved. But that, between, is not what the Constitution says. It says among. And by saying that the federal government can regulate commerce among the several states, it's thought to imply that what happens within Virginia is also the federal government's business sometimes. Perhaps when what happens in Virginia affects interstate commerce in some way, it is regulable. Or in other words, when it is within, interior to a state, but affects things that are happening between states. So among is therefore taken to imply within and between. And there are three categories of activities that have tended to attract the court's attention here. Pause this video for a second and take a look at section A of the cheat sheet, because I'm about to talk about those three categories. So something is said to be commerce among the states if, one, if an activity uses or affects the channels of interstate commerce, like, for instance, highways, waterways, flight paths, and etc. So what's most clear-cut is when it actually uses a highway, for instance, to cross state lines. But if it's in one state and affects these channels, then it might also qualify as commerce. Think of drunk driving as an example. There's an interesting story and history there regulating drunk driving during the Reagan era, but we might think, as at least a plausible argument that the drunk driving rules within any given state do affect what happens on the channels or in the channels of commerce, like a highway, channels that run interstate. Two, if it uses or affects the instrumentalities of interstate commerce, like registering a truck that will drive goods across borders, or if it is about the persons and things in interstate commerce, goods, for instance, or the drivers of those trucks, and so on and so forth. So think about truck drivers for a second. They are licensed in a state, Virginia perhaps, but there are also federal rules about how many hours they can drive, how much rest they might take, and so on and so forth. If Virginia's rule for licensing their truck drivers somehow affected the hours and rest rules, then it might inappropriately affect the instrumentalities of commerce, as the court likes to say. And then the third category they look at is if the things in question might be neither channels nor instrumentalities nor persons and things, but might still somehow substantially affect or substantially relate to interstate commerce. And I'm not going to give you an example of that just yet. We'll get to it. Okay, but first things first, to have a discussion about the federal government's power to regulate commerce, we have to first discuss the federal government's power and then get to regulating commerce. So the first case I'm going to talk to you about is actually about this, just the federal government's power. And it's why most courses actually start with this case, McCulloch versus Maryland from 1819. What this case did was it defined the scope of the US Congress's legislative power and how it relates to the power of American state legislatures. So this case isn't directly about the federal commerce power, but it is about what states can and can't do when the feds act on their powers. So here are the facts. The state of Maryland had attempted to impede the operation of the Second Bank of the United States within their own borders through a tax on all notes of banks not chartered in Maryland. That is, all money of banks not chartered in Maryland. Although Maryland's law, by its language, was generally applicable to all banks not chartered in Maryland, the Second Bank of the United States was the only out-of-state bank then existing in Maryland, and the law was thus recognized in the court's opinion as having specifically targeted the Second Bank of the United States. So here was the legal issue at stake. Chartering a bank was not expressly provided for in the Constitution's list of Congress's powers, but Congress said a bank was needed to further the actually listed express powers that Congress had been given in the Constitution. Then this is the rule that decides the case. In its decision, the Supreme Court argued first that the necessary and proper clause of the US Constitution gives the US federal government certain implied powers that are not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. So it can do lots of things to pursue its express powers with these implied powers. And they also argued that since the federal government is supreme over the state's ability to interfere with the federal government is limited. And there are two things I want you to notice about this case. The first is that it separates implied from express powers granted by the Constitution. The second is that without articulating it perfectly clearly, Chief Justice Marshall's opinion in this case, McCulloch versus Maryland, suggests that when the federal government chooses to act on its implied powers, state actions must give way. In the absence of federal action, perhaps the states can do as they choose, but in the presence of federal action, the federal decision is supreme. Its powers may lay dormant, as some people say, but when exercised, they are the powers that prevail. And this suggestion about federal powers was spelled out in greater detail in a case about 5 years later called Gibbons versus Ogden. It's a case from 1824. And this one is indeed about the Commerce Clause, so it applies the general findings of McCulloch specifically to the explicit power to regulate commerce among the several states, which we're talking about here today. Here are the facts of Gibbons versus Ogden. In this case, Mr. Ogden had a business ferrying passengers from New York City to Elizabethtown, New Jersey. However, Ogden didn't have the license to do this directly granted to him. He had it because he got it from two other people, the steamboat inventors Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton, who held monopoly charters to control all steamboat lines within New York and, separately, all steamboat lines within New Jersey. So recall, it was assumed at the time that a charter granted to a corporation was indeed a monopoly. Now, to have a monopoly on steamboat lines within both states also seemed to control what could be done between the states, because you can't ferry passengers from one and drop them off in the other unless you operate in both of those states. So Ogden, who had a license granted to him by the monopolists Fulton and Livingston, sued to block Gibbons. He was a new steamship operator who was granted a license to ferry passengers on the very same route, New York City to Elizabethtown, by Congress. Ogden wanted to stop Gibbons from competing against him. And again, being a chartered corporation, it was assumed granted him the power to block competition. But Chief Justice Marshall decided otherwise. He found that the Commerce Clause granted Congress the power to issue the license to Gibbons. Commerce, Marshall said, is more than just the buying and selling of objects. It includes all branches of commercial intercourse between states, including navigation, or, as I said before, the channels of commerce, like steamship lines, are also commerce. So navigation is commerce. So that was the first thing Marshall had to answer. Are steamboat lines commerce? But then he had to answer whether the law granting Gibbons the New York to New Jersey route regulated commerce among the several states. And he interpreted among as, quote, intermingled with. And he said it was therefore okay that the federal action in this case would affect the monopoly that had been granted to Livingston and Fulton, a monopoly that had been granted solely within the states of New York and New Jersey. So here's the rule he articulated about that. New York and New Jersey could do things to regulate commerce within their own states, but when the federal government acted to regulate commerce among or intermingled with that in the states, its acts under McCulloch versus Maryland were supreme. It acted under a necessary and proper power in carrying out its explicit commerce power. This left the states some power to regulate things happening solely within their states, but gave to the federal government also some power to affect things within those states when those things affected commerce among the states. Like Gibbons had to pick up passengers within New Jersey to transfer them between New Jersey and New York. And Marshall said exactly this in his decision. Commerce among the states cannot stop at the external boundary line of each state, but may be introduced into the interior. Yet, comprehensive as the word among is, it may very properly be restricted to that commerce which concerns more states than one. And we didn't read this case, but this quote here is really quite important for understanding our later cases. So take a second with it here. Marshall was saying that the federal government could regulate commerce happening within a state, but only when it concerns commerce that touches more states than one. But here's one problem with the case. Notice that Gibbons versus Ogden left a very important question open. Was New York, in this case, being told that it could regulate things within its borders which affected interstate commerce as well? It's clear that the feds were being told they could regulate things that occurred between states. That's certain. And also sometimes that they could regulate things happening within states when those concerned commerce between at least two. But what about the reverse? The reverse would be when a state regulated things within that ended up affecting commerce between. There are really two possibilities here. Either New York might be told that it could not regulate anything that even somewhat affects commerce among the states, or it might be told that it could go ahead and regulate, but only in the absence of federal action. So what does the Commerce Clause really require? Does it imply that Congress has all the power to regulate commerce among the several states and is the only body with that power? Or does it imply that, as in McCulloch, that Congress has the supreme power to regulate commerce among the states, whereas the states had certain powers they could exercise so long as they weren't contradictory to federal action? On this latter interpretation, the state power depends on the absence of federal action, as in McCulloch. The second issue, therefore, is sometimes called the issue of the dormant Commerce Clause. And the court, to tell you the truth, has never seemed to be able to answer that question. They've gone back and forth, as we'll see on our next video. Nor do they seem ever to be able to give a single answer to other questions relevant to the Commerce Clause. So in our second video, as I said, we're going to cover the sometimes meandering, sometimes contradictory path of the Supreme Court in its jurisprudence on the Commerce Clause, and that'll prep us for the test case that we'll do together in class. So I'll see you for that second video and then also in class.